So we'll now consider H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. Domestic terrorism is not new, but domestic terror plots and attacks are at the highest level they have been in decades. Look no further than the horrific mass shootings this weekend in Buffalo, New York, which was fueled by white supremacy and hate. H.R. 350 would coordinate the efforts of multiple federal agencies working to investigate and prosecute such cases. It establishes an interagency task force to improve coordination in combating white supremacist infiltration of uniformed services and federal law enforcement. Some of us have been sounding the alarm on this for decades, yet warnings have fallen on deaf ears. And most of us experienced the rising tide of radicalization ourselves on January 6, 2021. Among the attackers were members of organized white supremacist and terrorist groups who helped plan and coordinate that horrific, terrible, awful day. So this is about what kind of country we're going to be. And I just want to say that last Congress, Republicans agreed with Democrats to pass nearly identical legislation by voice vote. But this year, every Republican on the Judiciary Committee voted against it. And that's even after the committee adopted a Republican amendment to require the formal recording of false domestic terrorism reports. So far, 3 Republicans have co-sponsored this bill. But this should really get strong bipartisan support on the floor. I hope that that's what happens. In any event, with that, I yield to my good friend from Mr. Cole for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're back this morning on an additional item, H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2022. A similar piece of legislation passed the House 2 years ago under suspension of the rules. Yet the fact that we are meeting on it today underscores the fact that circumstances have dramatically changed, and not for the better. Since the House last considered this legislation, what has the Biden administration done with the tools it already has to combat domestic terrorism? Use them against parents, against moms and dads desperately concerned for the education of their children and deeply damaging impact that the pandemic policies were having on their children's lives. Make no mistake, House Republicans are committed to our national security, to combating all forms of violence, and to ensuring our law enforcement has the tools it needs to keep us safe from enemies both foreign and domestic. H.R. 350 does nothing to enhance this capability. Instead, it mandates reports that haven't been asked for, creates more bureaucracy where ample exists, and has a chilling effect that will limit state and local law enforcement's efforts to recruit and retain qualified candidates. If Democrats are serious about combating domestic terrorism in all forms, I know my Republican colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, who have been shut out of the process at every turn, have substantive and meaningful ideas to bring to the table. I hope we will do better in the future, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before I yield to our witnesses, I just want to remind everybody that we have to end this portion of the Rules Committee within about 40 minutes because of the joint session. So it'd be my hope that we could all be succinct and get this hearing portion out of the way so we don't have to have Mr. Nadler and Mr. Issa back. Not that we don't appreciate you all here, but I'm just trying to, I know everyone has schedules. So with that, let me now recognize the gentleman from New York, Chairman Nadler, for any opening remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2022. In 2018, a gunman shot and killed 11 worshipers attending Shabbat services at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. In 2019, another gunman shot and killed 22 shoppers at an El Paso Walmart. Over the weekend, yet another assailant allegedly shot and killed 10 people at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. These are tragedies. I could cite many others, and I could spend my time here today talking about the scourge of gun violence, or the dramatic rise in the number of hate crimes, or the obvious consequences of the hate-filled rhetoric that fills our airways and has sadly been adopted by some of our colleagues. Instead, I want to use my time to point out what these 3 cases have in common. The gunman in each case was a white man, each angry about so-called replacement theory, each traveling some distance to target a minority community, each hoping to terrorize that community through mass murder. This is not right. It's not normal. It's not consistent with who we are as a country. We must act. And H.R. 350, which sits before us today, is the least we can do to signal our opposition to white nationalism and this rising menace of organized intolerance. H.R. 350 creates 3 offices, one each within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the FBI, to monitor, investigate, and prosecute cases of domestic terrorism. These newly created offices would issue biannual reports to Congress assessing the state of domestic terrorism threats with a specific focus on white supremacists. The bill requires these offices to focus their resources based on the data collected and the most significant threats, which would be described in detail in their joint reports to Congress. Recent white supremacist attacks have reminded minority communities across the country of a dark history we have not yet escaped. Last Congress, in response to this continued threat, the House passed this legislation by voice vote on suspension of the rules. Unfortunately, the bill languished in the Senate. Since then, our constituents have continued to face intimidation and violence. Recent attacks include the murder of 6 people of Asian descent at spas in Atlanta last summer, 5 Jewish Americans being held hostage in their Texas synagogue, numerous bomb threats phoned into historically Black colleges and universities last February, and of course, the violence in Buffalo just days ago. Because every part of the country deserves a responsive, well-trained response to this kind of violence, the bill also requires DOJ and DHS to provide training and resources to assist state and local law enforcement agencies in understanding, detecting, and deterring acts of domestic terrorism and violent white supremacy. And because there should be no confusion that we are targeting criminal activity as opposed to the legitimate religious or political activity of most citizens, the manager's amendment to H.R. 350 also includes an explicit protection for First Amendment rights and other constitutionally protected activity. This legislation is a bipartisan solution to a serious and documented problem facing our country. I want to thank Representative Brad Schneider and Senator Dick Durbin for their diligent work in developing and introducing the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act here in the House and in the Senate. The House stood together last Congress to pass this legislation in a bipartisan fashion. I urge my colleagues to do so once again. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be here and to address on this important issue. Ranking Member Cole, as both of you know, the last thing that this country needs is more domestic surveillance. This DOJ has not earned the right to be given the power to conduct more domestic surveillance. Because we know this DOJ and this FBI have already abused that power given to it by this Congress, I'm here today to tell you that what seemed to be an innocuous bill last Congress today is yet another example of why we cannot, without reform, cannot give additional authority to the Department of Justice. This bill is not the right answer. H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2022, duplicates existing resources within the federal government. And I'm going to repeat that. This duplicates existing resources. Where did we hear that before? Mr. McGovern, before 9/11, we had a hodgepodge of duplicated and redundant organizations pointing at each other, each reaching a consensus, each not seeing what was there. The fact is, this is not a consolidation to find white supremacists in this country. This is, in fact, an expansion of more agencies, more reports, but not, in fact, any sort of efficiency to deal with what we already have. Worse, this bill hamstrings men and women in law enforcement. Most egregiously, this, in fact, makes the assumption that white supremacy is rampant within the men and women in blue. This sort of attack and targeting goes to the very crux of what has happened in the 2 years since this was previously authored. H.R. 350 adds bureaucracy, creating 3 offices in the Department of Homeland Security alone and the Department of Justice and FBI with missions to combat domestic terrorism a mission they already have. And with these bureaucracies come more bureaucratic thinking. Instead of allowing law enforcement to participate in emerging threats, the bill mandates the agencies focus on the most, and this is in parentheses, most significant domestic terrorism threats as determined by the preceding 6-month period. Anyone would know that MS-13 will kill more people than all of the items talked about by the chairman of the committee in his opening statement. In other words, H.R. 350 may require law enforcement to ignore many of the evolving domestic terrorist threats, or in fact, crime that is killing on our streets as we speak, organized crime, some of it very race-related. Now is not the time to have such static thinking. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, 2020 and 2021 marked the highest numbers of domestic terrorist attacks and plots since 1994. In 2021, roughly 40% of the incidents were associated with anti-fascist and like-minded terrorists. And the most frequent targets of these incidents were government, military, and police locations and personnel. And I repeat that. The target of these anarchists was, in fact, law enforcement, the military, and the government itself. But H.R. 350 fails to direct any additional resources to deal with those rising threats. Well, the left-wing groups are targeting law enforcement, and proponents of this bill are spreading the false narrative that American law enforcement is overrun with white supremacist and neo-Nazi sympathizers. That was said in the committee, and I say it again, it is not true. Our men and women in blue are the most integrated forces around the country. It has been a long time since the 1960s when Martin Luther King was begging white officers to come into black neighborhoods to help bring law and order. The fact is, law enforcement match the color of their constituents, and they are in those communities at great risk. Just a few days ago, we commemorated the over 600 men and women who gave their life this year in law enforcement at the memorial. This was the highest number in modern history, and if I'm correct, only was exceeded on 9/11 in that awful tragedy. This bill mandates investigations into armed services and law enforcement for the possible infiltration of white supremacist and neo-Nazi sympathizers. In other words, it makes an assumption of something that has not been proven and causes the FBI to be looking. It has the authority if they have probable cause or even reasonable cause. It says instead, with no cause, you have to look into it. Yet these studies show domestic terrorism incidents are far more likely to be committed against the military and law enforcement than committed by military and law enforcement personnel. The bill glaringly ignores the persistent domestic terrorism threats from the radical left in this country, and instead makes an assumption that is all on the right and the white. Former Attorney General Bill Barr made crystal clear that AFTIVA and the far left extremist groups were involved and investigating possible violent activity. FBI Director Chris Wray added that AFTIVA is exploiting the situation to pursue violent extremist agendas, and yet this bill would act as though those groups don't exist or that they are simply peaceful protesters. Democrats, bless your hearts, do not want to talk about these issues here today. In fact, the committee markup had an amendment offered by Rep. Stubbe that added AFTIVA and the radical left organizations to the term white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups, and that was taken down on straight party line. Committee Democrats uniformly rejected that amendment. Republicans continue to want to hold out a hand. The chairman, I'll close with this, the chairman said that this was bipartisan, and in fact, I believe there are 3 Republican sponsors, co-sponsors. Those Republican sponsors came on before the bill was attempted to be amended on a bipartisan basis. The ranking member was never consulted nor allowed to do an advance worked to try to make this bill better, and each and every one of our amendments during a more than 12-hour period were struck down on straight party line. This is not what one would call bipartisan in the normal sense. The same committee that passed this 2 years earlier had deep concerns, voiced those concerns, and Mr. Chairman, those concerns were ignored. With that, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I don't have any questions. I just will say I'm deeply disappointed with your statement. I'm deeply disappointed with the way your leadership has reacted to this issue. And maybe a calculation has been made that it's not politically advantageous to take a stand against a rising tide of white supremacism in this country. I mean, you have members that put on their social media events that they attend that are sponsored by white supremacists. You can't get anybody to criticize the so-called great replacement theory that seemed to have fueled the shooting in Buffalo. I mean, it is so disappointing to me, and I get it. Do whatever you got to do, I mean, to please the base, but it is so unfortunate for this country that at this moment that we can't come together on this. I mean, I feel the same way about those who continue to defend what happened on January 6th in this chamber. People died that day. People were hurt that day. Capitol Police were wounded. 140 police were wounded, and yet we have people here that still, praise those who came to the Capitol and can't get the Republican leadership to take a strong stand against all of that. And to me, we're at a point where I'm hoping that well, we'll see what happens, on the floor. But I'm hoping that there are members that will all agree that white supremacism, including anti-Semitism, which is the basis of so much of this, is wrong, intolerable, and the idea that somehow it's controversial today where it wasn't in the last Congress is mind-boggling to me. But in any event, thanks for being here, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Issa, for joining us today. I appreciate your testimony and share your concerns about the events that have transpired since the House considered this legislation. These events prevent many Republicans from supporting this bill without additional safeguards and more appropriate resourcing. I want to be clear about the facts surrounding the administration's treatment of parents as domestic terrorists, just so there's no misunderstanding about what transpired. And I'd like to engage in a series of brief questions and answers with you just to ensure that the record is clear. On September 29th, 2021, did the National School Boards Association ask the Biden administration's Attorney General to use the Patriot Act against parents?
Yes, they did.
5 days later, in response to this letter, did the Attorney General issue a memorandum directing the FBI and U.S. attorneys to convene meetings and open up a threat reporting line to these parents?
Yes, they did.
And 16 days later, in response to the memorandum, did the Counterterrorism and Criminal Division of the FBI send an email to agents across the country directing them to apply a, quote, threat tag, unquote, to parents attending school board meetings?
Mr. Cole, that's in the public record. Yes, they did.
And it's my understanding that the Judiciary Committee has emails showing that the Department of Education asked the National School Boards Association to send the initial letter. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the individual who signed the letter from the National School Boards Association was given a job at the Department of Education?
Right so.
Okay, and finally, the DOJ memo has never been rescinded. The Attorney General has not come before the committee to answer questions about this matter, and the Judiciary Democrats have not held any oversights on this matter. Is that correct?
That is correct, and we have requested.
Okay, thank you very much. And until we get to the bottom of these kinds of issues, I think we're going to have problems passing legislation.
Mr. Cole,
back. Yes.
I would like to just use one moment for Mr. McGovern's benefit. I denounce what happened on January 6th. I lost constituents on January 6th. We all were there, and it was an awful event and one that should never be allowed to be repeated. I grew up in a neighborhood, in a Jewish neighborhood, and I've seen anti-Semitism firsthand, and it still exists. And I will and always will denounce the white supremacist or anyone who thinks they're better based on their race. And my party does so too. And members of the committee made that clear during the markup. We've noted the technical problems in this bill that failed to be addressed, and that's the reason we're here. It's not that we're not for the bill, it's that we're not for the bill in the form it is, and particularly, as Mr. Cole said, targeting parents for their, quote, extreme views of wanting to address the education of their children. I thank the gentleman for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you. Again, if those who are so outraged about January 6th, it would have been nice if everybody voted for the Select Committee. Mrs. Torres.
Not just voted for the Select Committee, but also voted to impeach the person that caused that. It's outrageous what we are listening to here today. This bill does not call out any specific organization. This bill gives DOJ, the FBI, the alphabet soup of law enforcement, the tools that they need, which include training, assessment. It gives all of the tools that they need. You know something, Representative Issa, I am happy that none of us here in Congress lost any of our colleagues during January 6th. I am really happy that nobody was injured. Emotionally, yes, but nobody had to be transferred to the hospital on that day. I am really happy that you did not have a relative, a loved one, a friend at that church, at any of the churches. I am really happy that none of your friends or relatives or even donors were at that theater or in El Paso and Buffalo. I'm really happy that you can come to this committee and hold your head up about what is and what isn't extremist, terrorism, domestic terrorism. But some of us are not that fortunate. Some of us are not that fortunate. And some of us do feel for the victims that are injured by domestic terrorism. This bill simply does that. It gives the tools to our law enforcement. You can't say, not you, but we cannot say and put up a sign that says we support law enforcement, but then call them out for holding up democracy in this Capitol. Training is important for our law enforcement, ensuring that there is no infiltration of the people that want to hurt our Constitution, our democracy, and our communities is important. I support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Reshethala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I'd like to associate my remarks with that of the ranking member and Mr. Issa. With that, Mr. Issa, were there any attempts by Democrats on the Judiciary Committee to work in a bipartisan matter? And if so, what were the opportunities where we could have had a bipartisan approach to this bill?
Thank you for your question. There were a number of outreaches by the ranking member, Mr. Jordan, and staff. And none of our amendments were secrets. We let the majority know what we were looking at in advance, and they let us know that they were dead on arrival. I think one of the areas that Ms. Torres probably pointed out, but I think was factually incorrect on, that was most significant, is that the very fact that you're going to empower federal agencies to look for whether there's any initial evidence of it in an organization or not, look for, quote, the infiltration of white supremacy within law enforcement. The entire country, everywhere, was one area that we thought there was a lot of opportunity to say, look, we're looking for white supremacy. Yes, that's fine. We're looking for groups that are building weapons and terrorism, why are we looking at law enforcement? How many examples of organized law enforcement have there ever been where law enforcement is going after and terrorizing a neighborhood compared to the very acts that the chairman of this committee and the chairman of Judiciary just mentioned? So we wanted to be supportive of looking for pockets of possible terrorism. And by the way, Ms. Torres, when she went on about supporting local law enforcement, that's what this bill could have done. And we let them know that if what we were doing is not accusing those in blue, but in fact empowering and training, that there was an opportunity for bipartisan support. Clearly, we wanted to make sure that what would be off limits would be school board meetings of parents talking about their children, and there was no chance of that negotiation after the teachers' union had weighed in.
Thanks, Mr. Issa. I think that's incredibly unfortunate. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Issa, you and I have served together for a long time now.
And I'm just a freshman, you know
You're
that.
just a freshman, but a freshman with a lot of experience. And I guess what I'm bothered by and is you gave a lot of examples of what about this and what about them and what about, and, you know, I mean, I guess in this instance and with this bill, I'm thinking about what about the worshipers? What about the shoppers? What about the victims of these mass shootings? And that's really what I think this bill is designed to help those people who really have been left, you know, with this void in their lives. They're dead and their families have this giant void. And I guess that's the concern that this bill really does address. And technically, there may be other ways to improve it, and I appreciate that. But on the other hand, the real focus is on the victims here, and I think that's been not ignored, but isn't taken into consideration in all the other whatabouts that you talked about. And I'm going to yield back to the chair.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member and Mr. Issa, and I just wanted to kind of follow up a little bit on Mr. Reschenthaler had asked about the opportunities that were there or not there for Republicans to have input. And I guess maybe it's more of a comment. At the beginning of the hearing, the chair had talked about how he had wanted, you know, he was disappointed that Republicans weren't supporting it and all kinds of, but I'm disappointed that Republicans weren't allowed the kind of input that they needed to have. And I think that you get better legislation when there is input. And the concerns that Mr. Issa has expressed could have been addressed in some way. And so I guess I just, I think that when we hear all about how horrible it is that the Republicans, you know, don't support this bill, they weren't allowed to have any input. There's no discussion, you know, or regarding that. And I just, if there was anything else, because I think we all are opposed to domestic terrorism. It's, but they could have addressed the issues we had with the bill. And Mr. Issa, do you have anything else you wanted to add on that topic?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the most important thing is the redundancy. I want to add one thing. These three new organizations have titles, but in fact there are titles for counterterrorism, domestic counterterrorism, and so on within each of these agencies already. And that's one of the most disconcerting areas is you can take an existing, as you know, when you're dealing with bureaucracy, you can take an existing organization, the Department of Justice, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security more broadly, and you can say, is there someone already who has this mantle? And if so, can we direct them to give us these reports? Can we, in fact, direct them to do certain things? And the answer, of course, is yes. But this bill is much more of a shotgun of new reporting and new, if you will, stovepipes. And so probably the most important thing, and I'm glad my colleague is back here again, is that he is right. What this does, we want to do, and we support. What it does but won't guarantee against, we object, including going after our parents before a school board. So one of the areas that's missed is when we agree, let's do something together, and we could have. As we made clear in the markup for hours and hours and hours, 12 hours, was we can find existing organizations within these, so we're not creating new stovepipes. We can, in fact, empower them, but limit them in these new areas, and the money goes further. All of those things we could do. Again, experience and the evidence that we put out in the markup of the conduct of the teachers union, the conduct of the Department of Justice in targeting parents who were legitimately objecting and calling them domestic terrorists simply because of their free speech, that created a concern that we addressed, but the Democrats were unwilling to address back. And so I appreciate your question because it's right on the money.
Thank you very much, Mr. Issa, and I appreciate that. And it is disappointing that, and I sat through, I wasn't there every moment of the 12 hours, but,
You did your share.
yeah, we have to eat and, and things like that. But it's just disappointing that the implication is that Republicans, support domestic terrorism when we don't support this bill. And so it is disappointing that that's the implication when you.
And just one more thing, one of the questions that's not being addressed is why this didn't go anywhere in the Senate. I've been told by a number of senators it didn't go anywhere because there's a point of redundancy and inefficiency that they feel their job is, we made a message. Their message was, we're not going to waste the taxpayers' money on completely redundant organizations with lots of new reports. We didn't address that in the markup, as you know, and had we addressed it, this would have had a chance of getting through the Senate. It has very little chance of getting through the Senate right now because it is so flawed.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. And I just, for the gentlelady referred to me, I just want to make sure my sentiments were accurate. Yeah, I am disappointed that a bill that was not controversial in the last session all of a sudden has become controversial. I'm disappointed about that. I also said I was disappointed at what I believe is the Republican leadership's, quote, enabling of white nationalism in this country. And that's just not my view. That is the view of the former number 3 leader in your party.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I think the difference between what has happened is we've had the issues with the school boards being, with the parents being attacked at school boards and things like that. So I think it's changed from when you say that.
Well, no, I really.
There's things that have changed since the bill was there
Well,
before.
I would respectfully say that not a lot has changed, and especially the silence from the leadership of your party. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish I had 3 hours, but I just have 3 minutes to discuss where we are right now. I rise in strong support of the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. And like you, Mr. Chairman, I find it absolutely astonishing that people belonging to Abraham Lincoln's party are here to oppose it in 2022. I want to submit for the record an article from PolitiFact in November entitled, "No, the FBI is not adding threat tags for parents who protest school boards." This article demonstrates that this is an absolute distortion. Nobody has had a threat tag added to their record because of First Amendment action. That threat tag was created just for people who threaten our teachers, our school boards, our principals, and so on. So if there is someone who intends to do harm to our students, our teachers, our schools, if someone intends to inflict domestic terror on them, and they happen to have children of their own, yes, they would be included. But if they're just there to participate in the school board meeting, the way millions of people do across the country, of course, they don't get a record. Secondly, armed white supremacy has unleashed a reign of terror against minority communities. We saw it a couple of days ago in Buffalo, where a white supremacist jacked up on replacement theory, which you can watch on the news pretty much every day or every other day on Fox News, decided after months of planning to go into an African-American community in Buffalo and shoot up a grocery, and he executed 10 people. But we've seen similar examples of racist-inspired mass murder in El Paso, in a Walmart, in the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. We have seen it in movie theaters. We've seen it in churches, as in Charleston, South Carolina. We've seen it all over the country. And this is the 198th mass shooting in 2022 alone. I would just recommend to all of my colleagues, whether Democrat or Republican, President Lincoln's famous Lyceum speech, where he said that if tragedy, downfall ever came to America, it would not be because of some superpowers abroad. It would be because of mob violence and racist vigilante violence in America. And he identified this as the threat to our country. And I would urge all of my colleagues to go back and read President Lincoln's Lyceum speech about what the real threat to the country is. And I find it terribly sad, tragic even, that we cannot unite on a bipartisan basis today to support the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I think Mr. Cole's done Ranking Member Cole's done such a great job of outlining the difficulties. And Mr. Issa, I so appreciate you outlining the duplication that is prevalent in this legislation that we have before us today, and that in itself is an impediment to actually getting something done. You looked as if you wanted to address something while Mr. Raskin was speaking.
I'm afraid
I'm happy to yield to you.
Thank you. And this may be the last time I get time yielded. So Mr. Raskin did a wonderful job of testifying, but he was doing that. He was testifying as to evidence. We have from testimony of the Attorney General on May 11th of 2022, and we'll submit it for the record, where he's going over school board meetings in which parents testified and they opened investigations. So the idea that, well, we're only doing this against, some outside group, that's not true. The markers would have been used against these parents who came before and made statements to the school board of their disapproval. And so I'll put that in for the record if you want. Additionally, the Department of Justice, after the previous bill was proposed, went through and delivered to the minority details of the redundancy and why it was unnecessary. So just the fact that we would have liked to have directed these three new organizations to instead be existing organizations given the specific responsibility would not have been a heavy lift for a truly bipartisan bill. But it does make a difference. It is creating stovepipes. Stovepipes mean that you're going to have a different organization looking at one versus the other. But most importantly, we have two areas that we disagree on that they would not come with us on. One was parents who simply come before school boards. The other was the men and women who wear blue, those tens of thousands of men, 600 plus of whom died this year doing their job, who were specifically being targeted in this. And if one doesn't upset you, the other should. And the idea that we're, quote, going to train, from what I can tell, the training will be training the sites on law enforcement and looking for, quote, white supremacists there. And if that's the case, then I'm sorry, but this Department of Justice and this FBI does not have the confidence of at least the Republicans. And I thank you for giving me that opportunity. I'll put these in for the record for those who care to read them.
Yeah, and just one last point. One of the parents who testified, was he not concerned because of a sexual assault that occurred against his child?
Absolutely. And, these are the kinds of things that frustrate parents, and they come before, and they're amateurs. So, yes, they're going to say things that are not articulate to the nth degree. But again, looking for domestic terrorism at school board meetings seems to be a micro-targeted attempt to intimidate parents by the teachers' unions who do not want parents to be involved in that way. There's no question at all. This is heavy-handed, to say the least.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Scanlon.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, as a former school board member and someone who's worked in the educational field for decades, I have to take exception to your very offensive remarks.
You should see what our teachers' union in California does to PAC school boards. I'm sure you were not one of them, but
Reclaiming my time,
we do
sir.
see it.
So, your perverse and perverted retelling of what actually happened last summer when parents were lied to by national leaders and urged to go act in uncivil manners towards teachers, towards administrators, towards school boards, we saw threats, we saw assaults, we saw school board members' children threatened. That is the context in which there was legitimate concern that people were being whipped into a frenzy by conspiracy theories and lies for political gain. And we've seen that happen time and time again. But obviously, the worst instances are situations like what happened this past weekend in Buffalo, continuing the pattern of hate that we've seen play out in El Paso, in Charleston, in Pittsburgh, and so many other cities and towns across the country. These crimes are attacks on our American concept of community, our American ideal of people of different backgrounds and experiences working together for the common good. The words and deeds of these domestic terrorists and anyone who lacks the moral center or courage to call them out and condemn that ideology are an attack on our American community, a hateful effort to separate Americans and turn us against each other, undermining the foundation of our community and our country. So I wholly intend to support this legislation. We are Americans. We must choose community over chaos, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli, I know you're going to manage this on the floor.
I'll reserve my comments for the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Sanye,
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Ross, Mr. DeGoose. Any other member wish to ask a question? If not, Chairman Nadler, Mr. Issa, thank you very much. You are free to go. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to, will include in the record Leader McCarthy's statements denouncing white supremacy in response to your earlier statements.
Yeah, well,
Thank
and
you.
my statement still stands. I am so deeply disappointed in the way the Republican leadership has reacted to a whole series of events. And so, without objection, it's submitted in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Are there any other members who wish to testify in H.R. 350? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H.R. 350. Without objection, the committee stands in recess. We plan to reconvene immediately after the joint session concludes, and we will be in touch with all your staffs.
little better, yeah. Thank you for asking.
I'm going to consider H.R. 7790, the Emergency Supplemental Appropriations Bill to address the shortage of infant formula in the United States. It is unconscionable that many families are struggling to find safe and affordable baby formula. This is an issue that I'm hearing directly from my constituents about. I know many of you are as well. And I hope this is an issue that we can find at least some common ground on. This crisis was caused by corporate negligence and corporate monopolies, plain and simple. Just a handful of companies control the vast majority of formula. And in this case, it appears that one of those companies may have produced unsafe products that have had to be recalled. We're moving forward with this bill swiftly to address the crisis. H.R. 7790 provides $28 million in emergency funding to give the Food and Drug Administration the resources it needs to address this urgent infant formula shortage. And to America's parents, I just want to say, we hear you, we see you, and we are taking swift emergency action here to help you. And with that, I yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We're here again on yet another additional item, H.R. 7790, the Infant Formula Supplemental Appropriations Act. As with every crisis Democrats are trying to respond to this week, this bill is yet another case of creating the appearance of responding without actually doing anything. And I, for one, am frustrated. While it's clear that I personally have no use for baby formula and haven't for a rather long time, the issue is too important to just put forward a political messaging bill. Real lives are at stake. Instead of agreeing to real bipartisan solutions to address this issue facing constituents in every congressional district, the majority thinks giving another $28 million to the FDA is the solution. Give me a break. For the last 3 months, the United States has slowly fallen into the grips of an infant formula supply crisis. At present, reports indicate that more than 40% of the formula is out of stock across the country. This is especially apparent with specialty formulas, which are becoming much more difficult to find. As parents become increasingly desperate to find formula to feed their babies, we are hearing more and more stories of people driving hundreds of miles over many long hours on the mere rumor of finding formula. And yesterday, Health and Human Services Secretary Becerra stated in an interview on CNN that he's been aware of this crisis beginning last year. If this is accurate, we had ample opportunity to address this before it became a life and death situation for so many people. Unfortunately, the bill the majority is now proposing will do nothing to address this crisis and will do nothing to provide support to parents and get them the formula their babies need. Instead, the bill provides a $28 million check to the FDA with no offsets. That's it. No idea what they will do with it, no idea how it will help, no solutions or path to success at all. Just millions of more to the FDA just 2 months after they already received a $102 million budget increase in the FY22 appropriations bill. There are many things that could be done that this bill does not do. The bill does not force the FDA to develop a plan to address the shortage. It does not take into account excess stocks of formula at federal agencies that could be redirected to American households immediately. It does not mandate funds be used to rush formula to where they're needed the most, and it does not redirect unspent dollars that are no longer needed elsewhere toward providing a real solution to this crisis. All in all, it's a sorry state of affairs. This could be and should have been a bipartisan bill, but instead, the Speaker and the majority decided to go it alone to make it look like they were doing something about this crisis without actually doing anything. And sadly, that continues to be the majority's modus operandi this entire week, as it has been this entire Congress. I hope the House will do the right thing, reject this measure, and send a clear message to the Speaker that the American people demand real bipartisan solutions. On a crisis this important and this critical, the American people deserve more than a talking point. They deserve something real. I yield back.
Thank you. And I would like now to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony in H.R. 7790, the Infant Formula Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2022. Chairwoman DeLauro, Ranking Member Granger, we're delighted that you are here. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Chairwoman DeLauro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Cole and the members of the Rules Committee, for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss supplemental funding legislation to address the infant formula shortage in the country. The bill immediately addresses the shortage, and it will help to prevent potentially this from happening again. But the shortage is caused in large part by corporate greed and due to a disgraceful lack of oversight. It's now causing parents and caregivers to struggle to feed their kids. The images of empty shelves and desperate parents are heartbreaking. But we must act, and we must act now. The FDA plays a critical role in ensuring that formula provides the full nutritional needs of infants and that it is manufactured in the safest way possible. We must make sure a lack of funding is not a barrier to getting safe formula to parents and to babies. That is why you have the bill before you. It addresses this pressing need by providing $28 million in new funding for the FDA. This legislation will provide FDA urgently needed resources to address the shortage, to prevent fraudulent products from entering the marketplace, and to help acquire better data on the situation in the marketplace. To prevent shortages from happening again, we will strengthen the workforce focused on formula issues and increase FDA inspection staff. Meeting this need today is necessary to ensure that no baby goes hungry, no parent has to struggle to find the food to feed their child, and our efforts for the future will help ensure we are never forced back into this disappointing situation. Furthermore, I intend to address the terrible safety issues that led to 2 babies dying, at least 2 babies dying, and several others being hospitalized, which is why I released a whistleblower report which highlighted a damning list of allegations of wrongdoing of the Abbott Nutrition Factory in Sturgis, Michigan, producing a formula that in fact they knew was contaminated. They falsified records. They didn't test the seals on the cans properly, and they sent untested infant formula into the commercial market. That's just to name a few of the infractions. Abbott has been putting production and profits before people, and it is wrong. We must simultaneously find solutions that prevent contamination and shortage from happening. We should not have to choose, and parents should not have to choose between safety, food safety, and supply. I reject this dangerous and a false dichotomy. Our work here is not done. I am proud to be here today because the bill meets the moment, keeps our babies fed, and I respectfully request an appropriate rule for floor consideration of this critical legislation, and I look forward to answering your questions. Indeed, in fact, there is a description of how the money will be spent. Infant formula and supply chain monitoring and assessment, health fraud, state partnerships, laboratory methods, from the Office of Regulatory Affairs, social media data, analysis to identify unsafe infant formula products. That's going to the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Infant formula staffing needs going at $23 million at the moment, understand that the CFSAN Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling, infant formula, this is the group that examines the submissions of infant formula when the submission comes from a domestic source, a foreign source. They have 9 employees. They do not have the inspection staff to go out to a non-FDA approved facility to do the proper inspections so that in fact they could get on an FDA approved list. By not investing this, we are then complicit in what has been an outrageous failure. And I will not sit here and not say that while Abbott, a bad actor, that will be investigated, and that investigation will lead to accountability. And by the same token, I'm not afraid here to say today that the Food and Drug Administration, which knew about, or at least had information about contamination from last October, dragged their feet in doing something here. And that is why we want to try to provide the opportunity for being able to import a product from a FDA facility, approved FDA facility, to provide us with product, and we could do this on a product that we can then get put on the shelves. That is a moral responsibility, to get product on the shelves, no matter how you feel about any agency or any manufacturer, both of whom are culpable in this effort. It is our job to make sure that the product is there so that mothers and fathers are not worried that they can get it, and by the same token are worried that they may provide a contaminated product to their baby. I thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Granger, welcome. Make sure your microphone's on.
Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, thank you for allowing me to testify on this bill to address the current shortage of infant formula. It's unacceptable that parents do not have access to the formula their young children need. There are reports that more than 40% of baby formula is sold out across the United States. Some families are having to drive hours just so their children don't go to bed hungry. At a time when Americans are paying record high gas prices, no one can afford this. This is a true crisis. It's also an opportunity for bipartisanship. Members on our side of the aisle wanted to work together to help these families and caregivers. Unfortunately, Speaker Pelosi decided to walk away from good faith negotiations. There are two major problems with the bill. First, the bill before us essentially constitutes a blank check for the FDA. 2 months ago, we increased the FDA's operating budget by $102 million. This included $11 million increase specifically for maternal and infant health and nutrition. There's also more than $1 billion that the Department of Agriculture was supposed to use to address supply chain issues. It's unclear why these existing funds can't be spent. Republicans offered numerous ideas, but my colleagues on the other side of the aisle dismissed them. Second, this bill does nothing to address the reports of federal agencies having excess stock of formula that could be directed to American households. And it doesn't do anything to force the FDA to come up with a plan to address the formula shortage. Mr. Chairman, what is most concerning is this bill won't fix the problem. I ask that the committee provide a rule that allows the bill to be amended when it's considered on the floor. And I thank you for allowing me to testify before you today, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I always begin, whenever I have my chairwoman and my ranking member here, these are my two favorite members of Congress. And so if somebody has to be a jerk, where's Burgess when I need him? I know both my friends know this. I admire them both greatly. I appreciate the job they did, and I think they've this year already delivered an enormous accomplishment in getting us the fiscal year total omnibus budget done and negotiated. And I've often commented, I think the good sense was on our side of the aisle. We were ready to get this stuff done last fall. It took the Senate forever to get itself in a position to negotiate. So I'm not surprised, since the two of you have been successful at dealing with tough problems, that one's been thrown at you yet again, sort of out of left field. This is not primarily, or at least essentially, an appropriations problem. There's a lot more, as the ranking member suggested, that need to be done here. And I want to commend my good friend, the chairwoman, on her very even-handed condemnation of all those involved. This is clearly a bad actor in terms of the company, and it's clearly a gross negligence on the part of the regulator, the entity that we all fund and voted to increase funds for only a couple of months ago to do all this. So and I know you got to do something. I guess I would ask this, and I'll start with the chairwoman. Given that the FDA was aware of this impending shortage last year, why, in your opinion, and I know you're outraged by this, didn't they use existing resources? They got transfer authority, there's other pots of money, or just tell us you got a problem here. I'm sure they didn't approach either of you two and give you that information. You probably learned about it like the rest of us, sort of in the newspapers. So, any idea, and I know you're trying to get to the bottom of this, Madam Chair, why they waited so long?
Well, no, I don't have an answer for that, and that's the question that I have, which is why, even before there was a whistleblower report, that when the first articles came out about the shortage, because I spent a large part of my career here dealing with food safety issues as chair of the Ag Subcommittee, that I called for an Inspector General investigation. I then was made aware of a whistleblower's report. At a hearing for the Ag Subcommittee with the Secretary Vilsack, because it is through USDA that this, Abbott has a $1.7 billion contract with the U.S. They service most of the WIC program. It's about more than 50% goes to the WIC program. So I spoke about the whistleblower's report there, and it's pretty extraordinary what Abbott did. And then, I looked at when this report was sent to the FDA, and then when there was any activity. Sent in October, and I've said this publicly, so I'm saying it right here, and the FDA knows how I feel about this. There were no interviews until December, and then there was a recall in February. So why they did not move as quickly is something, as I've called for an Inspector General's report with a company. I'm asking for an investigation of what happened. To that end, there is a hearing this Thursday under Sanford Bishop's jurisdiction where the head of the FDA will be there. We have experts coming in next week. Our committee sent an invitation to Abbott to testify. I believe they're testifying before Energy and Commerce next week. We will have this piece of legislation which deals with the short term, because there's a short-term problem that we have, and we have to address it. And then longer term, there is legislation in order to provide the kinds of authorities that FDA needs to tighten up what needs there, because that needs to be examined as well as that. I don't know why they didn't move. They should have moved.
Okay. Let me ask this to both of you. I mean, I've read the bill. It's a pretty short bill, unusually short for an appropriations bill, quite frankly, because we're usually what is the money going to be used for? Because it doesn't really say in the legislation.
Well, anyway, I started to say that. Let me just, because I delineated that. There are several. Here we go. Infant formula supply chain monitoring and assessment. It's $1.5 million. To complete the analysis of the infant formula as a critical commodity, to inform future efforts to ensure supply chains for the products remain strong, to be able to withstand a variety of challenges. Understand here, and I apologize for taking time, what's happened to the industry here. Part of the issue here is since 1989, we have been consolidating an industry. In the same way we do meat packing, we have done it here. There are only 4 manufacturers of infant formula in the United States. Abbott, Mead Johnson, Perrigo, and there's one more, Gerber, okay? So when you have the manufacturer with 50 to 66% of the infant formula goes to WIC recipients. You have that hold on the market. When you have a crisis like this and it's recalled, you then are faced with not being able to fill in the gaps as quickly as, and that's part of this consolidation issue, the road that we've gone down, which is very detrimental. So the supply chain issue is addressed. Health fraud, state partnerships, laboratory methods development, $3 million is going to the Office of Regulatory Affairs. Improve the IT system, expand current health fraud tools, dealing with consumer complaint process, building the databases to identify trends, to find out and investigate formulas that are sold on the online markets. I have a fear if we do not deal with FDA-approved facilities and that we open this up, that then we are going to, we then are flying blind. And again, we do not have an inspection personnel and a personnel to deal with these submissions right now that could accommodate what comes in over the transom. Social media data capture analysis to identify unsafe infant formula products. $500,000 for the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. To look at surveillance of the marketplaces, to look at fraudulent products, unsafe alternatives. Staffing needs, the biggest item that's going to ORA and to CIFSAN. The staff to better address formula safety and supply issues. As I mentioned, and look, I sent over a list of questions for the FDA, and they responded to me, and that's where I found out that in terms of these submissions that will be made for people to be considered, they have 9 staff people. They don't have an inspection force that can go out and, you know, you go overseas or you go and you have to inspect the facility. You have to do all that's time consuming. And today, overall, and the fact of this is not so many people know this, the volume of food coming into the United States of America, it's maybe 1% of that food is inspected. 1%. So they are very understaffed. I don't say that as a cover for what was done. I really don't, not at all. But we have to understand that about the structure of how we deal with food safety in this country is critical. And from my own personal view, I have proposed, many of you may have heard, a separate agency on food safety, because nowhere in the federal government is there an individual, an agency that has the ultimate responsibility for food safety. I'm sorry to take so long, but I think this is a bigger picture than is understood just by the nature. And by the way, in the legislation, in deference to my colleague, who we have a great relationship, and we did have conversations with the Republicans, but it says, the Commissioner of Food and Drugs shall report to the Committee on Appropriations of the House of Representatives and the Senate on a weekly basis on obligations and funding under this heading in this act to address the shortage of infant formula and certain medical foods in the United States. So to try to accommodate that view as well, that they need to report.
Ranking Member Granger, I want to let you respond, and then I have an additional question you might incorporate in your response, which just, given how poorly this agency has clearly done its job, you have confidence that they'll spend the money the way the chairwoman's lined out? Because it's not in the legislation. It doesn't go point by point by point. And this is no disrespect to either of you. I have a hard time trusting these guys, given the mess that we're in now, without having a lot more specific language in the bill, which, you know, goes to your point.
I could not agree more. I absolutely agree with that. This is a terrible situation. And the people that were asking to fix it are the people that caused it. So I have a big problem with that. I think we should slow it down. Like I say, the bill does nothing to address the reports of the federal agency have excess stock, a formula that could have been directed and wasn't. It doesn't do anything to force the FDA to come up with a plan to how they will address this and spend the money. Included $11 million increase specifically for maternal and infant health. There's so many things we should be doing in reaction to this situation, like I say, and we as Republicans made those suggestions and were not accepted. And I can't support the bill as it is. I think we need to take the time, a very short time, and put together a bill that says this is what happened and this is how it's going to be cured. And I'm like you, I don't want to trust the people that allowed this to happen, but also the delay when they knew there was a problem. Delay for an infant formula.
Well,
It's outrageous.
let me just say, in all deference, the federal government, the question of the federal government having stocks of formula laying around, it doesn't. I have been in close contact with FEMA. We currently have on hand formula for 550 infants for 1 week. FEMA doesn't regularly stock significant quantities of infant formula. It has a limited number of what they call infant toddler kits to backstop operations. It typically adds the formula component to the kids early in the hurricane season because of the formula's very short life. We do not have the stocks. We investigated that as well. We did have conversations with my Republican colleagues. The reasons, and we went back and forth. We were in constant contact with the Republicans. This is a straightforward supplemental, and I don't understand why that we cannot achieve bipartisan support on which is a very simple issue. Let's strengthen what we have at the moment. Let's move as fast as we can to get product on the shelf. And I've been out front in laying blame in two directions. I have no problem with that. But we also are asking for reporting on a weekly basis so that, in fact, we can monitor what's being there and we can deal with it, correct it with it. And we're only looking to do this until I believe it is it November? Only until November, until we get back on track. And let's lay blame where it lies and hold people accountable when we get to the investigations of all of that. At the moment, we have an immediate need.
We came to the table to work together with the Democrats. Absolutely. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. You all know that. We came to the table to work together and offered ideas and offered solutions and finally walked away.
I won't believe we've had, this has actually been an enlightening discussion in a lot of ways. All this suggests to me, Mr. Chairman, just for your consideration, is this is the perfect bill for an open rule. I mean, there's not a lot in it, honestly. It's 4 pages long. It's a blank check to an agency that has failed, and to an industry or a company that we do not trust for good reason. So I would think on the floor you could put these things out there, and you probably couldn't tell, because I think the outrage is genuine on both sides of the aisle here, and we would probably end up with a product that was overwhelmingly supported. But count me as skeptical. Just write a check to people that haven't done a very good job. I have a lot of faith in our two witnesses, without question. I have a lot of faith in the FDA. And I'd like to be a lot more specific. And frankly, I'd like to demand something out of them in terms of a longer-term plan. As the chairwoman suggests, this is going to be a problem for a while. This is, there's a lot of reasons why we ended up in this spot. And the FDA needs to give us more than, hey, we get some money and trust us. Now, I want to see what the plan is. I want a date certain in the bill. We can start providing the funding. We could do that, but lay it out, in the way that the chairwoman just did, that is not in this bill. It is, I have no doubt she will operate according to what she says. I have zero doubt. I have lots of doubt that they will. But with that observation, I'll yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Torres.
Okay.
You're muted.
You're muted, Norma. Either that or you have to open a window.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm not very good at this, I guess, with rules. The Chairman, I just want to give thanks to Chairwoman DeLauro for her and work on this bill. We know how committed she is to our babies and very much appreciate her releasing the whistleblower report and continuing to focus on getting to the bottom of this, which is what we all want. We cannot scapegoat federal employees doing their job, calling out, a company that did right by recalling this product that was hurting babies. Where we go from here, I think it's all in our best interest, in everyone's best interest, certainly in the baby's best interest, to ensure that we're working together to get to the bottom of it and to get formula back in the supermarket shelf where it needs to be. Thank you. I support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Reschnithaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just associate my remarks with the ranking member and say that it's nice to see my ranking member of Appropriations and Chairwoman of Appropriations, and thanks for all your hard work. Just one comment. I love the glasses, Chairwoman. Thank you very much. Thank you. And on that, I'd like to yield back.
So, one of these days, one of these days, he'd like to associate himself with my remarks, but I don't know when that would be. But Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A couple things. Just thanks for tackling this subject. So I got a lot of kids, and I was with one of my daughters this weekend at a farmer's market. She's due at the end of June, early July, and she goes, "Dad, should I be worried about this?" And I said, "Well, it's a problem right now, and I'm sorry that two of you haven't worked out the particulars, but I am glad we're addressing this, because it needs to be addressed. If I'm getting questions from one of my daughters about, what's happening with the formula, obviously this is something that's got a lot of young families panicked.
Absolutely.
And so I appreciate the willingness of your committee to tackle it. I know you two will end up working out the details and make it so that it works, so that there is accountability on the agency, accountability on this company, and that there is increased production to stop this shortage that we've been facing. Number one. Number two, Mr. Chair, if it's okay, I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege, and I promise I'm not going to talk about cannabis and banking, okay?
Not about banking, okay.
But what I do want to talk about is Jeff O'Neill behind me. So many of you know I'm not going to run for re-election. Jeff has been with me since the 2008 campaign, has been with us ever since, and there's a cup. He has a cup in our office. Jeff knows everything. Okay? He does know everything. I don't want him to get a big head, but he does know everything, and he's been essential. He's the deputy chief of our office. He is essential to all sorts of things we do, but particularly my science committee assignment and my rules committee assignment. He has been an invaluable member of our office. He's helped me get a VA hospital built in Aurora, Colorado, when it was really difficult and we had a lot of problems, and I want to thank the Appropriations Committee for helping me get that done too. And he's helped on a whole array of science matters, but particularly space exploration, and that's what he's going to go do next. He's going to go to work for a company called Planet, which is a newer company, but it already has 1,000 employees out of San Francisco. So Jeff, I just want to thank you. You've been, I said he's helped with assignments. He's been invaluable to me on this rules committee. And I think to a lot of us, he's really been a helpful individual in, pressing through on some of the subjects that we've have. Macarena Tapia, Mac for short, is going to take his place. Why don't you two stand so you can see the difference in these two, please? But they both are, have just been tremendous parts of my team. And Jeff's, this is his last week. He leaves on Friday. Take a few weeks to go to Bali and then start to work. But anyway, Jeff O'Neill, you're great, and thank you for letting me have this moment of personal privilege.
Take care.
Thank you. And let me say,
Godspeed.
yeah, and let me say, Jeff, on behalf of all of us on this committee, we appreciate your work because you not only have served with distinction, Mr. Perlmutter, but to all of us here, and we all are one family. We're going to miss you, and yeah. Don says, remind me, we appreciate you holding Perlmutter back, but anyway, we hope you have a good trip to Bali. I'm jealous.
Does anybody have a bad trip to Bali?
I don't know.
No way. It's great.
It's Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I would associate myself with the comments of the ranking member, and I do appreciate that he talked about how this is less than 2 pages, just a little less than 2 pages, but it spends $28 million, and we don't know what it's going to do. And I mean, and Chairwoman, you gave a list of kind of things that it's going to be spent on, but that's not in the bill. And I guess I have a little bit of a little cynical thinking that if we don't say it, we don't know if it's going to happen. And I don't believe in just spending $28 million on a hope and a prayer that they're going to be able to solve this, because we give them no structure on how to solve this problem. And Chairwoman, you said we got to get product on the shelf. I don't see that. It doesn't say that we're going to get product on the shelf. And I think ranking member also talked about, how the you mentioned that they caused the problem, and now we're giving them more money.
No,
And
they
I
didn't
see
cause the problem.
or they were added to the
laboratories
issues,
caused the
added to the
problem.
issues. But all I see that this for an additional amount for salaries and expenses. That's the only information in here. And I was just kind of curious, do we have any clue as to how many FTEs we're going to be adding to the federal government with this bill?
No.
Okay.
No, I work with them to do that, and that's why we want to report. That's why we built in a reporting mechanism so that they can't just go off and do whatever they want, and that we have the ability to make sure that they are adhering to what was laid out.
Well, and with all due respect, it makes more sense to lay it out in the legislation that we're putting into law when we're talking about $28 million. When we're talking about $1 million, we should know where that money's going. When we're talking about 28, we should know where every dime is going to. But I have real concerns.
But just might say, the funds can only be used for FDA-regulated infant formula. They can't be used for anything else.
And
it's about
ma'am,
to shortage.
reclaiming my time, where does,
I'm sorry.
can you give me the exact point where that is in the bill? I mean, it's only 2 pages.
We're not talking about spending a lot of time. In other words, there are things that should be in this bill to say, we take this very seriously. Here's what you should be doing, here's what you should be doing now. And certainly not trying to slow anything up, but you don't get a lot of times where you can say, okay, we're going to come back in a year and do this. Yeah. It's not that kind of situation. So we really need to take the time and do it right and be very specific in this. They obviously did not do what they should be doing, and so that's why we are where we are.
It's laid out on the first page here. I mean, it doesn't. It says, for an additional amount, there shall be available to address the current shortage of FDA regulated.
Oh, okay.
But it provided that is about the report, and also provided the amount is designated by the Congress as being for an emergency requirement, according to various sections of the code. Anyway.
But we have no way of how that's going to happen. This appropriates the money, and it tells them, generally where it's going to go, but it does not. And so I have real concerns. And then another question was, is this even going to, is there any talk about in the Senate? Is what's going to happen? I mean, we're talking about a serious issue. I mean, we are talking about baby formula. I have a granddaughter who just turned 1, so, you know, that's, she just got off of formula not that long ago. But I guess I don't see where this actually addresses the issue and gets those babies taken care of. If that's, and ma'am, you were very, very passionate, but I don't think the passion is reflected in this bill, where we really are going to be doing something for these children to get them formula. And like I said,
It's hard to put passion
in the
into
Senate.
legalese, but
Well, if you
anyway,
can
I
at least
understand what you're saying.
But
I
all of the
understand what
things you
you're
said
saying.
about getting product on the shelf.
I understand what you're saying.
But it just doesn't reflect in here, and it's a lot of money, and I don't think it's going to address the issue like we want it to, and get the formula on the shelves. And is there any indication of what the Senate's going to do?
I've talked to the Senate. If I were to tell you, sit here and tell you that I can predict what the Senate does, you know, you'd say, she doesn't belong here. So
Okay,
I
no,
don't
and
know what the
I
Senate
appreciate,
does.
no, I appreciate that.
I don't
but
know
I
what
was
the
They
just-
are aware. Everyone's aware of this.
Right, and everybody
I have
wants-
two staffers that have very young children, and we went through this morning about what do you do now, you know? And it's a very serious situation.
But, and I understand, it, like I said, a very serious situation, but this, we haven't, I mean, if we don't know what the Senate's going to do, they haven't agreed or even, and I recognize that the Senate's its own deal over there, but if they would recognize that this is the answer to the issue.
I hope
and
they will.
I
I
doubt
hope they will. We're in conversation with the Senate, as we were in conversation with our Republican colleagues. So, I mean, the conversations are on. We're not just doing this in the dead of night. It's, you know, they're, so, but I understand. the
I mean, I
concerns.
have grave
Sure.
concerns about, you know, getting that formula out to the kids. And I wish there was more to this bill that would actually do that, because this spends $28 million and isn't going to do a thing for getting that formula.
Well,
back on the
I
shelf.
disagree with that, but you're
And with
entitled
that,
to your view.
Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Raskin. Mr. Raskin.
Yes.
Oh, was I?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Want to thank Chair DeLauro for her hard work on this and for bringing this forward. I mean, it just seems like no matter what we're talking about, it could be violent white supremacist attacks on our people in Buffalo and across the country, or the baby formula shortage. And all we're hearing from our friends across the aisle is no, no, no. There's nothing that can be done. And just a series of complaints. But look, there are ongoing supply chain issues. The shortage in formula was exacerbated by the formula recall when Abbott Nutrition, the largest baby formula manufacturer in the country, had to issue a recall due to contamination concerns that sickened 4 infants and tragically led to 2 of them losing their lives. And so there's been a panic among a lot of our constituents, and we need to act. And I appreciate this legislation, and I hope everybody will vote for the Infant Formula Supplemental Appropriations Act. And thank you for taking positive action, Ms. DeLauro, and not just bemoaning and bewailing our situation. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. All right, we'll try one more time with Mr. DeSaulnier, if you have any questions that you'd like to pose.
Only to say I support the bill and want to welcome Jeff to go from working for Mr. Herbalter to a San Francisco-based company.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Ms. Ross for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to commend Chairwoman DeLauro for her swift action on this. Remember, this is about our future. It's about our families, and very much in support of the bill. Thank you for your leadership.
Well, I will simply say, I want to say thank you to both the chair and the ranking member for coming before the committee. And I think, Madam Chair, we're very grateful for your willingness to suggest a solution, to come forward with a solution. I think we can have a reasonable debate about the contours of that solution, and some might believe that it isn't as effective as they would like. Others believe that it is very effective. That's a debate that we can and we should have. But I think it's also important to keep perspective, because I don't know of any other solutions that have been suggested via legislation before this committee or any of the other committees of jurisdiction. I thank you for stepping forward to provide a solution and saying, here is a path forward. And again, let's have the debate about ways to improve it or enhance it. But to me, this certainly is a step in the right direction. So I'm grateful. With that, I believe we will be done with questions. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony. Please leave with our stenographer or submit electronically anything you'd like to be inserted in the record, and you're now both excused. Thank you. All right, are there any other members who wish to testify on H.R. 7790? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H.R. 7790. I believe the chair is worried that I might go rogue, so we're going to recess. Without objection, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
The Rules Committee will come to order. Before I yield to Mr. Morelli for a motion, I want to yield to Mr. Perlmutter for a formal introduction.
Yes, I would like to introduce students from the Colorado School of Mines, part of the Bruce Grucock Scholars Program, and which is, they get a tremendous engineering education at the School of Mines. This program is designed to help them become community leaders as well, you know, see what we're doing here in the Congress and the like. So we're very happy that you're here, and you know, you're going to hear some interesting amendments and objections, and we'll see where all of this takes us.
We actually know where they'll all go. The right way.
Oh, the other thing I would say to the class, we're operating in hybrid mode, so there are a number of people on who will be voting. We've got a North Carolinian, two Californians on the hybrid.
Okay. So at this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee report a closed rule for consideration of H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2022. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary now printed in the bill, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions of the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 7688, the Consumer Fuel Price Gouging Prevention Act, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions of the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those further amendments to H.R. 7688 printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part C of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 7790, the Infant Formula Supplemental Appropriations Act 2022, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule provides one motion to recommit. Finally, the rule provides that at any time during the legislative day of May 19, 2022, the Speaker may entertain motions offered by the Majority Leader or a designee that the House suspend the rules with respect to multiple measures that were on the object of motions to suspend the rules on May 16th, 17th, 18th, or 19th, 2022, and on which the yeas and nays were ordered, and further proceedings postponed. The chair shall put the question on any such motion without debate or intervening motion, and the ordering of the yeas and nays on postponed motions to suspend the rules with respect to such measures is vacated.
Do you want to explain that to everybody, Mr. Perlmutter? No, I mean, you heard the motion from the gentleman from New York. Are there any amendments for discussion? Mr. Cole.
I just have one amendment, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to get an open rule on H.R. 7790. That's the Baby Formula Appropriations Act. Everybody here heard the discussion. There's nothing in that bill. It's just a $28 million blank check to FDA, which is bungled. I really appreciate Chairwoman Delores' testimony because I thought it was very even-handed. She was tough on the company. It deserves it. She was tough on the regulators who have left us a terrible problem. And I just don't trust them just to give them $28 million and count on them. Now, I will tell you this, in full defense of my chairwoman, I wouldn't want Rosa DeLauro breathing down my neck on this, and she will. So I don't have any doubt about her credibility, but I think our credibility is on the line as an institution. And I think we ought to be demanding something besides just fixing the problem. I mean, I want an explanation. I want a timeline. I want some assurance this won't happen again. All those things are subject, and we could do that under an open rule. I doubt we would vote very differently on any of the amendments that would be put forward on the floor on this. I do not see this as a partisan issue. I see it as a good governance issue, and we just don't have the substance inside that appropriations package as it is. It's not like a normal appropriations bill. We don't do, here's $28 million. It's boom, 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 line by line, program by program, quite often with dates attached. So I would suggest on this one, we slice it out, have an open rule.
Mr. Chair?
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any
Chairman?
discussion, Mr. Perlmutter?
Yeah, just for everybody. So you heard Mr. Morelli go through a whole bunch of things about motions and division of the question and all that sort of stuff. The rule, as he read it, determines the debate, establishes the debate on these three different bills that we're considering and what the rules are. Mr. Cole has asked for an open rule, which means any amendment by anybody on the particular bill dealing with infant formula. And we remember in the House we have 435 people, plus or minus a few. So there could be a lot of amendments. But to his point, he thinks that this should be subject to an open rule. We'll see where the vote goes.
With gentlemen yield, just as a matter of further explanation, the Rules Committee really exists so we don't have to follow our own rules. And that's what you're going to watch.
Actually, the Rules Committee exists so we're not the United States Senate, which is, can't get anything done, right, which is a good thing. Any other discussion on, or explanation? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed,
Aye.
no. Opposed, no. No. In opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli. No. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross.
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mr. Rushenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach. Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Any other amendments? If not, the vote is now on the motion from the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
Aye.
Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter.
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Aye. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross.
Aye.
Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess. No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mr. Rushenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed to. And I hope you're all impressed with our eloquence. You see the power of the chair. And Mr. Morelli will handle this for the Democrats. And Mr. Reschenthal will handle for the Republic. So we're done. We're not meeting anymore, right?
I hope we don't know of any other meetings.
Yeah, so we don't know of any other meetings, and so love being with all of you. It's always so much fun. Appreciate it. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.